This is a pretty scary article, and I absolutely agree with it, sadly. Supply chains are never going back to normal, says freightwaves.com. Oh, let me pause this real quick. This is Craig Fuller, the CEO of Freightwaves at freightwaves.com. Yeah, this is enlightening, 100%. Supply chains will remain under constant threat of disruption for the next decade. Supply chains operate best when global trade is peaceful or the world is peaceful and stable. A smoothly running supply chain requires buffer stock, which is challenging with declining population. There is a conflict between ESG goals and supply chains optimized for cost and speed. If we prioritize ESG, we will need to contend with supply chain risks. We should never prioritize ESG because it's such a scam. A buffer stock was needed for smoothly running supply chains, which is challenging given declining population demographics. Since the end of the Cold War, global supply chains have benefited from peaceful trade between developed and developing countries. Many poorer and less developed countries that were previously ruled by commies took advantage of new markets in the developed world and used global trade to move beyond subsistence economies to prosperous ones. Some of the countries developed in capitalistic and democratic countries, while others exploited the free market system to solely benefit for those already in power, and that was China, for instance. Labor is the key in supply chains. The arbitrage between the developed and the developing countries has been massive. The cost of producing goods in the countries with cheap labor, lax environmental and labor regulations, and little regard for sustainable natural resources, has enabled the world to enjoy unprecedented prosperity and peace. I could not agree. That is so fundamentally correct. The arbitrage between us and our freaking holier-than-thou ESG and fair trade and all that crap. It's all fake, dudes. All fake. All virtue signaling, but a bunch of fakers. Fakers. And what happens is we're selling our manufacturing to companies that can do it for cheaper labor, cheaper employee costs, plus lax environmental and employment regulation. 100%. It's such a scam, and yet we still do it. Why do you think Nike is so keen on China? Disney is so keen on China? Because they care about Colin Kaepernick? Are you freaking crazy? Because the goods produced in these parts were so cheap, it made sense that they would be produced in excess. This buffer stock kept inflation in check and provided supply chains with ample supplies that could fend off short-term fluctuations and disruptions. And there have been many disruptions, as my man says here, right there. He talks about disruptions, economic, natural disasters, terrorism, economic cycles, and capacity shortages. Always create disruptions. All right. Think about how the cost of televisions and computing hardware has fallen over the past decade, and how auto prices haven't risen as significantly as the many improvements made in the vehicles we drive. This all happened at a time when the U.S. was the only superpower around, and the only expectation was that the U.S. had of the other nations was to trade unobstructed. Cheap labor is becoming scarcer, particularly in Asia. Why? Because of aging populations. The average age continues to increase and there are fewer people to work in these manufacturing jobs. That, my friends, is the demographic time bomb, 100%. Then, of course, we got ESG. Companies have instituted ESG requirements that require disclosures and monitoring of how and where products are sourced. This pressure means that goods are produced in factories that don't match Western standards for environmental controls and human rights may not be available to Western consumers anymore. Well, they'll be available to the rich people, the AOCs and the Greta Thunbergs, whatever the hell her freaking name is. Not for you and I, Joe Schmo. You okay, big guy? The factories that do produce goods that match Western standards will often be more expensive and then therefore will be less buffer stock in the system to keep inflation in check. 100%, man. And of course, what does that mean? They're going to move some of that stuff back here because like, why are we paying cheap labor if we got to pay for it high because of the ESG stuff? The same ESG standards also create challenges for commodity producers, as the cost of adhering to environmental and social disclosures make it more expensive and less production. Higher cost of energy, higher inflation, shocking. It also discourages investment in the production of environmentally sensitive commodities, most obviously in energy. Environmental concerns and regulations that prevented exploration and production and killed pipeline projects are largely the reason the world currently lacks sufficient energy resources to buffer against the consequences of the Russia-Ukraine war. That again. Environmental concerns and government and regulations have prevented exploration and production and killed pipeline projects, which are the reason for what we're going through now, given the Ukraine war. In the previous decades, 3 decades, supply chains have operated relatively smoothly because companies could source from around the world and not worry about a global military conflict or autocratic regime manufacturing. While international trade regulations were complicated to navigate, the world overall was trending towards larger, more open trade. As the United States has become more insular and has pulled back from being the world's policeman, see, I disagree with that 100%. We are not pulling back from being the world's policeman in the least. We're actually increasing being the world's policeman. And China has started to flex its muscles around the world has become far more unstable and less peaceful. China desires to take Taiwan as its own, risking sending the world into geopolitical crisis as more dangerous than at any point since World War II. I completely agree with that. I just think about this morning. If China goes forth with Taiwan, you want to see the stock market get killed. It's going to be brutal, man. So again, as I've said a couple times in the last few months, downshift 1 degree. If you're typically in Wellington, go to Wellesley. I was typically in VTV, now I'm in Wellington. If you're typically in Wellesley, and again, this is however you do it, you might want to downshift into something that's even less aggressive than Wellesley. I don't know if I'd do that. I think Wellesley's maybe 30, 70 stock to bond, but man, if you're right there on the cusp, I just think a downshift is worthwhile. I still think bonds have more upside than down, actually, in the next 1 to 3 years. So don't be hesitant to say, bonds. Buffer stocks of products are far less likely. You got a mothball in you there? Oh, he's cat dog. Buffer stocks of products are far less likely in the future as the cost of producing these items continue to rise. Cheap labor offered by large populations of young people is largely a thing of the past. This will make it more expensive for companies to produce buffer stock, and far less likely supply chains will continue to absorb short-term shocks that are inherent to global supply chain networks. This guy thinks Latin America will be the big winner going forward as it benefits greatly from having direct land and transportation with the United States and protected by the U.S. Navy. The American South and Midwest will also see an acceleration in manufacturing production as they can offer predictable and resilient sourcing without the geopolitical risk of foreign suppliers or the labor unions of the Rust Belt or the crazy politics of what's this idiot's name in Andrew Cuomo, the lady who took over for him. I mean, man, automation will become more important. Nearshore manufacturers try to offset higher production costs with robotics, and other automated production systems. Supply chain market intelligence systems will be critical. At the end of the day, it's all going to just lead to more costs. It has nothing to do with the printing of the press of the dollar, I should say. It has to do with the freaking lack of cheap labor and the lack of cheap energy. It's just that simple, man. Anyway, it's going to be in for a wild ride. Be prepared. If China just sets its eyes on Taiwan, you can see the market just getting destroyed, man. Because this Russia-Ukraine stuff is whatever. That would be a big deal. And what are we going to do? We're going to get involved in the United States? Man, we don't got the resources anymore. That's why sending $40 billion to Ukraine was just. All right. Love your thoughts. We'll see you.